Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. We are speaking with Kaylon Paterson, a space engineer who will be the fourth Trini to fly at zero gravity in very short order. He joins us to discuss where he is at, how he got there, and his plans for the future. How are you doing, Mr. Patterson?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me.
Definitely our pleasure. But even before we get to history or whatever, please give us an overview of the company that you're at the helm of.
Definitely. So Paterson Aerospace Systems is a space company that's focused on sustainability and environmental practices within the aerospace industry. It's not a new concept, but it's a concept that's largely undervalued and not really considered as parts of aerospace until more recently, where we've had real issues around space sustainability come up and threaten life and safety for a lot of folks.
But read and spell for me a little bit, please, because in terms of like that environmental sustainability, how does that match? How do you make? You say it's not a new concept, but like I said, break it down for me. Thank you.
Got it. So basically, I will say for the specific focus that we have right now is called space debris, or space domain awareness more largely, is a guy basically discovered this back in the 70s, that if we kept sending things up and not removing them, that eventually we won't be able to send anything else up because it'll be so cluttered, right? Orbits are very limited around the Earth. There's not a lot of space there, pun intended. And so eventually, if we kept sending things up and leaving them there, they'll start running into each other and creating more debris, more clutter in the orbital environment. So that affects everyday life, from your satellites, your television, your communications, your GPS, all these things. And so it would actually make life on Earth more difficult. And it would also prevent us from further exploring our solar system.
So what are some of the ways that you actually do that decluttering or mitigate these issues?
Right now, a lot of it is focused on improving the way we track things in orbit. There's a lot of technologies around that concept. There are a few companies that are also trying to do active removal of those dead satellites, for lack of a better term. And then there are rules, right? So the UN was the first to really put it in writing that you're supposed to remove your satellites after they go out of commission. And there's two ways to do that. You could send it further out, or you could pull it back into the atmosphere and let it burn up. A satellite costs a couple million US, so you don't necessarily want to do either of those things. So a lot of companies have found loopholes in ways they could keep their stuff going, which over time, things do degrade, materials degrade. And so regardless of if you want to keep it running or not, you end up with this mostly obsolete object just floating around in the same position and causing a lot of trouble for new people.
And this is one of the things that you would have been, I guess, instrumental in terms of bringing awareness to, because apparently there are actually workshops, so space domain awareness workshops. And I see that your company is one that would have been doing stuff virtually as well. Who are the people who are interested in these? Was it target market? What is that grouping like?
Yeah, so a lot of what the interest right now is government focused for large nations, the US, of course, but also the Europe and other nations like China and Russia are interested in making sure their stuff can stay active as long as possible and also avoiding getting hit by things. On the other side of that, you have commercial companies like SpaceX, right? So you might be familiar with Starlink. I heard that Trinidad is getting Starlink internet, if not already there. So with Starlink, you have a constellation of several thousand satellites flying really close together, and they need to know where the one next to it is, essentially. And if that doesn't happen accurately, they could run into each other, but they could also run into other things in their flight path. So you have a lot of these large companies that are trying to do these constellation satellites that are now affected by this. And then we could even talk about how it affects humanity because you send up astronauts into orbit on the ISS, for example. You know, their life is essentially threatened. And we've seen a lot of that in recent years where, you know, there have been emergency evacuations or emergency maneuvers of the ISS to avoid catastrophic collisions.
And we're speaking, Mr. Patterson, and one of the things I'm hearing and smiling at is the way that I'm hearing different artifacts, for want of a better term, in your accent. So, and the thing is that you would have spent a great deal of time in Trinidad and Tobago. So my question to you is your journey from your upbringing in Trinidad and Tobago to where you are now. What are some of those signposts along the way?
Definitely. I'm glad you picked up on the accent. So born and raised in Trinidad, went to Newtown Boys, then went to Fatima College for secondary school. I decided at the end of secondary school that I was more interested in physics than biology. And the questions I wanted to answer, I couldn't answer at home. So got on a plane, went to undergrad in Georgia for a little bit. Right after that, I got a fellowship opportunity to go study in Germany for a year and start my master's degree out there, which was very instrumental in establishing my position in the aerospace industry. Then I came back, finished my master's in the US, and I've just kind of been trying to really, you know, position myself in the industry since.
And you say that, and I continue smiling because one of the things I really appreciate about physics is that it just makes things make sense. And the way that some other disciplines would want to isolate things, it feels as though physics kind of connects the dots and say, okay, well, this has a handle on this, this influences this. But speak to the person, thank you, who may want to take those steps, but is still kind of nervous because this is what mommy and daddy saying, this is what my friends are doing, this is what the area that I'm from kind of produces in terms of jobs. What was it for you? Because the road to hell is paved with good intentions. There are many people who might want to, but don't necessarily do. What was it for you that made it more comfortable for you to go and seek those answers and stay here with some of those questions, but just kind of deal?
So first things first, don't take no for an answer. I got a lot of no's all the way through. I still get no's. I probably have an email waiting on me that's a no right now. But you know, people will tell you, okay, you know, where you're from, what industries are there, you should focus on that. Of course, I was probably going to filter into petroleum engineering or become a doctor or become a lawyer or something along those lines in Trinidad, but I was more focused on the bigger questions. And I realized at some point that I had to take a leap, right? I had to put my money where my mouth is, so to speak, and go after this thing that I was passionate about. Took a lot of motivation. My parents are definitely pivotal in that decision because they never discouraged me from making that decision. My mother raised me to always be, to see myself as my only competition, really. So I never the fellow students in class, never, you know, the other people on the rugby field, for example, but it was, what did you do yesterday and what could you do better today, and to keep that as the motivation for continuing to go forward. So I think parents definitely need to hear that, and they need to understand that, you know, your kids will have to make, you know, take risks in their life and make certain decisions, and they're eventually going to be adults. So if they don't take those risks now, it might end up worse in the future.
And you say that I'm getting a clearer picture now because even the fact that you are Rugger gives me a certain kind of idea about you because there's a kind of singularity, a purpose when you're on that field like that and everybody trying to pull you everywhere and you say, no, this is where I go in. Yeah. But we continue the conversation. When we return, we are speaking with Kaylon Paterson. Stay with us. We come back after this. welcome back. We're having a conversation with Kaylon Paterson, a space engineer, and realized we didn't talk about zero gravity as yet, or in terms of him going there. So I guess we're going to do that now. Mr. Patterson, what is the utility? Why it is you're doing what it is you're going to do shortly?
Okay, so in aerospace engineering, you have to hit certain criteria before you send something to space. You're not going to just build something on the ground and expect that it'll work perfectly when you get there. We have, decades of evidence to prove that that's not the best approach. So as humanity, we had to figure out ways to simulate the environment that we'll be operating in here on Earth as best as we can. So enter what's known as the Vomit Comet or the microgravity test plane, which is essentially what was initially used for astronauts to get a feel of what it would be to be weightless. And later on found utility in the idea of we can test things in this environment that are dependent on being in microgravity or reduced gravity before we send them up there, just so that we're sure when they get there, they'll operate as we intend them to. So a lot of it is very small scale. It has to fit inside of a plane, essentially, but it does a really good job of simulating that environment.
And with that in mind, I want you to, pun intended, expand my horizons a little bit, please, because I think sometimes when people hear zero gravity, they think they only think NASA.
Yeah.
But where do you fit? Where does your company fit in terms of the ecosystem? And there are things that people can do that are outside of NASA, but still they're able to be a space engineer. They're still able to aim towards some of these things. So make those links for me, thanks.
Definitely. So I will start with something that a mentor of mine always says and reminds me of and reminds all of her students of all the time. But it's not zero gravity, it's microgravity, right? And the idea behind that is not to correct you, but it's really to say that we cannot really achieve zero gravity within Earth orbit, right? It's not ever going to be exactly that. So how we fit into this is, we're testing something that we will eventually fly in orbit that will still be under the pull of gravity of Earth's gravity, which is why it stays in orbit. Um, People think of NASA obviously because NASA is the brand name for space, right? It's what's known, it's what everybody is they think of when they think astronauts, they think space. But you've also seen in recent times, more or less the last decade or so, that a lot of new companies have entered the space, pun intended. But that includes SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic and Virgin Orbit, these kinds of companies that are really commercial companies that are getting into the space industry. And that's really because there's been a larger recognition that commercial entities might have more capacity, more funding to do certain things that global governments may not, be able to convince their taxpayers that they should be spending money on. So commercial space, the new space economy essentially is what it's called, has recently really evolved into this thing that includes companies like mine, small businesses, small, researchers who are trying to do things to push humanity forward to the next, frontier.
What kind of distance are we thinking about in terms of, and I want to say altitude, but distance away from Earth, as in physical land, to move just beyond that barrier of micro to zero gravity?
That's a good question. So I could tell you that even as far out as GEO, which is geosynchronous orbit, which is, I don't have the exact numbers in my head, but it's several tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from Earth, you're still feeling the effects of gravity, right? Of Earth's gravity, essentially. So to be able to escape that, you then enter the solar system, but then you're now under the sun's gravity or another planet's gravity. So there's really no escape in gravity for the grander picture of that. And even if you went further out, you'd be looking at black hole gravities, which would be pulling you without you really being aware of it until you ended up too close to to think about it. So essentially, yeah, there's really no escaping. There's always something in space that's pulling on you.
That feels almost like people saying the more things change, the more they remain the same. It's just that you may have to learn the new parameters that you're dealing with, but at the same time, it's not as though you're able to totally absolve yourself or just run away from certain things. But the significance of this experiment flight test, where, where do we, how should we look at what it is you're going to do?
So I guess it's for the sake of the experiment, it's more so I'll look at how things move in microgravity and how we could track them using AI software. That's the bottom line of what the experiment is. And how that affects the grand scheme of things is that we have all this space debris kind of time back into the start of the conversation that's out there. We're tracking it from the ground, but not very accurately, and we need to get better at tracking it and allowing our active satellites to avoid getting hit. So our experiment is focused on making sure that technology can exist so that future spacecraft, satellites, etc., will be safe to operate in orbit.
What kind of preparations do you need to do as a human, as an individual, before before this happens?
So we're highly encouraged not to eat too long before the flight, and also told to not of course, like, just be at your best health, be as best as you can before you get there. Take things like Gravol or whatever it is to keep your stomach settled, because essentially what you're experiencing is that feeling when you're on a plane that it drops in altitude and you kind of feel your stomach come up and then it kind of settles back down, except this time it doesn't actually settle back down. So we'll be going through that about 20 times, and there's really no way they could prepare us for it outside of us like learning more about it and preparing mentally for the idea that we might be spewing at some point in that flight.
And this actually kind of reminds me of something I was reading about people entering flow states. Um, Surfing being something that can actually kind of shove people into a flow state, because you can't study what you're going to have for lunch when you come back. You can't study what's happening because you need to be totally present in that moment.
Right.
And coming out of the experience, it helps, and I guess it will help with the physicists in you in terms of like connecting dots laterally to come to conclusions that you may not have been able to when you're looking at things in a very linear sort of manner. But apart from just your company, are there partnerships? What are some of the things, because you spoke about no's, what are some of the no's that you would have had to go through before you got this yes, or this series of yeses, to allow you to be able to conduct what it is, this bit of business that you're going to be doing?
Sure. I will say that some of those no's might have just been proper alignment to where I was supposed to be. I'll definitely say that I've had a pretty interesting career for being as young as I am, in terms of the industry that I'm in. I happened to jump into the space industry right when it was picking back up. When I was in undergrad, I'll give you an example of a no. I had mentors that were telling me, hey, go be a mechanical engineer, go be an electrical engineer, go do computer science, because there's no space industry. It's not as big as you think. It all died away in the 80s essentially. And so I stuck with it because I knew where my heart was. And right when I came out of grad school, the Space Force got stood up. SpaceX was taking stuff to the ISS. We had all these new companies jumping in and developing technologies and doing all this stuff. So it was, perfect alignment for that. And that's just, my headstrongness, but also my passion for what it was that I wanted to do with my life that kind of kept me aligned with that. Um, I will also say that in terms of the yeses that aligned this particular test was, you know, my background, my education, but also like my passion for trying to bridge the sustainability gap in the aerospace industry. And this opportunity was provided through the National Society of Black Engineers, the Aurelia Institute, but there were also other organizations that partnered to bring this together, which were the Space Generation Advisory Council, which Trinidad actually has a chapter of. And so there's opportunities for folks across the world, especially in the Caribbean and Trinidad, to get opportunities like this to test. So it's not just unique to me. It's not an isolated thing that happened because I'm here. It's actually open opportunities to do these kinds of research as long as you're passionate about it and you have a good idea.
And I'm grateful that we're able to have this conversation and not just speak about the flight or the test itself, but a lot of the things that went into it, because many times the sum of parts, the Gestalt effect is real. So we want to thank you. We want to thank your support circle who continued pushing you and everyone else involved for what it is you're doing and what it is you continue to do. And on behalf of the entire TTT News team, this has been a conversation with Space Engineer Kaylon Paterson. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.